Thanks so much, Craig, and thanks to the Fire Science Consortium for hosting this webinar. I don't have an outline slide, but a brief outline of the presentation. We're going to give a little bit of background on oak barrens, kind of talk about the why of monitoring, why course level metrics and how they can be used. We will go through each of the metrics in some detail, and then finally at the very end we'll talk about the whole protocol that you might use. So if you're a detail person, those details will come at the end, but we're going to try to focus on big picture stuff up front. And we do hope to see all of you on August 7th in the field, where we can talk more about this concept and the metrics in the field. I do want to emphasize that what we've put together so far is sort of the result of Amy and my work in conjunction with Nate Stephen. Nate Farum with the Wisconsin DNR. And but what we've come up with so far are our best interpretation, and it's a draft, and we are really looking forward to your feedback as land managers, as field biologists, to refine those metrics into things that are the most useful for you and that can be the most effectively implemented on the ground with your expertise. I want to acknowledge some groups and individuals up front, primarily because this concept for course level metrics and monitoring is not my own. There's been a lot of pioneering work done by the Nature Conservancy in Michigan, especially Doug Pearsall and Steve Woods, who pioneered this idea way back in 2006 related to prairie fens. That was modified and refined further by folks at TNC and the U.S. Forest Service, including Heather Keogh, Matt Kleitch, and Jack McGowan-Stinsky. And finally, we've integrated we're taking it to a little bit of the next level by integrating concepts that are promoted by NatureServe, which is the umbrella organization of all natural heritage programs. And finally, obviously, we want to thank the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. So, and if you're somebody who likes references, there are some printed right there. Most of them are in the gray literature, but feel free to contact us or the authors if you would like a copy of some of these materials. First, some background on oak barrens. They are a globally imperiled community. NatureServe ranks them as a G2 community, which means that's one step below the most imperiled or rare ecosystems in the world. They are more rare than tropical rainforests. They are also rare in Wisconsin, and they have a similar rarity in Michigan and in Minnesota. That means that, particularly in Wisconsin, we have a high conservation responsibility for oak barrens because a lot of them that occur in the world occur right here in our own backyard. Oak barrens are not only rare, but they contain more rare species than any other natural community. This rather complicated bar chart is just to show the number of rare species that are strongly associated with various natural communities. This one is a subset of communities and species that occur in the Central Sand Plains ecological landscape, so the central part of the state, Glacial Lake, Wisconsin, a big area for oak barrens. And there's, in terms of the number of rare species associated with each community you might find there, oak barrens ranks at the top. Notice that it's also followed very closely by related natural communities like pine barrens, sand prairie, sand barrens, dry mesic prairie, and dry prairie. Some of the species that these include are the federally endangered Carner blue butterfly, the common nighthawk, slender glass lizard, the phlox moth, which is the picture of phlox, and the moth is actually circled in black there, and it blends right into the dark pink of the flower petal, really cool. And a lot of rare plants, including the dwarf milkweed. Oak barrens are also a management priority for the Wisconsin DNR, as determined by the recent alignment effort. And that's both at the regional level as well as for prescribed burning through the Barrens, grasslands, savannas, and wetlands habitat prioritization process. So the problem with all of that is that as interest in managing oak barrens has grown because of their rarity, because of the number of rare species that they support, there's a lot of people interested in managing oak barrens, which is a really terrific thing, and we need more of that on the ground. Management that is prescriptions that are used to restore oak barrens can include timber harvest, brushing, and or prescribed burns. This picture is an example of a restoration site where trees were thinned to low density several years ago. But notice the structure appears to be relatively good from the photo, but notice that the ground layer is a solid mat of Pennsylvania sedge. And we visited, this is one of the sites that we visited as we were developing these monitoring metrics and protocol, and that's about 99% cover of Pennsylvania sedge. And this is a pretty common scenario. So questions that may come to mind is this a high quality barren site? Have we restored the ground layer adequately? Is the tree density right in the structure? And we certainly can look at it and know that it would carry fire, but from the picture and then again from our surveys, it doesn't have a diverse native component of native grasses or forbs. And so one of the questions we wanted to tackle is how could a person evaluate a site like this initially and then over time throughout the restoration process to help them guide their management prescriptions and evaluation of management success, restoration success over time. To zoom out a little bit, other questions arise when we consider oak barren sites as they range across a range of quality across the state. So here we have 4 pictures from 4 different sites. One might ask, how do these 4 sites compare to one another? Are some higher quality or have higher ecological integrity than another? And how would you know, and how can you be sure and objectively evaluate that? If you have a site that is higher quality, how do you communicate that in an objective and concrete way to a fellow biologist or a forester or a supervisor? And how would you again objectively monitor the success of your treatments over time? These were the types of questions that inspired us to develop this monitoring protocol. And our goal was to design a methodology that was objective, repeatable, that could be tied to specific management objectives and inform different prescriptions over time, but that could also be easily implemented by managers or technicians, regardless of whether they were really plant experts. So a summary of the problem: we know that management of oak barrens is really critical. They're globally imperiled. They support a lot of rare species. It's a priority for the department and for other partners. We know that the DNR and other partners are spending a lot of money on restoration. And so we need to document progress of restoration and effectiveness. We need ways to objectively compare between sites to help with prioritization. But we also know that there aren't enough resources to assess barrens and monitor using fine scale indicators of condition. Those types of resources being like time, botanical expertise, and money. So the solution we came up with, inspired by the Nature Conservancy, Forest Service, and others, was what we call a course level oak barrens monitoring protocol. And that consists of easily assessed metrics that can be used to assess the initial condition of a site. It can be used to track progress of restoration and management against objective criteria. And it does require basic knowledge of barrens ecology and plants, but no extensive botanical expertise is needed. One of the principles I like to emphasize in presentations like this is to start with why. As a manager, why do you need one more thing to do? You're already very strapped for time and effort, and thank you for even having the interest and time to attend this webinar today. But if you had more time, why would this be one thing that you would add? Well, I would ask you, wouldn't it be nice if you could submit a map like this in your next grant report showing your management progress from one year to the next, or to a supervisor, or just to document what worked and what didn't in a particular management unit? Wouldn't it be nice if you could say with confidence, my site's a priority, it's really high quality, and we are doing good things to improve or maintain the quality. And not only that, but we are monitoring what we do using objective, scientifically based criteria. And wouldn't it be awesome if all of that took you less than a day per year per site? So that kind of sounds like a tall order, but our metrics, the metrics that we've come up with, are designed so that managers and stewards can evaluate restoration success and determine the next restoration or management prescription needed without relying on external botanists, ecological consultants, complicated plots, and transects and things like that. So I mentioned this idea of course level metrics. One of the other principles that's foundational to this is the idea of ecological integrity. Ecological integrity is a concept that is used extensively by NatureServe, that umbrella organization of all heritage programs, and it's grounded in the best scientific understanding of high-functioning ecosystems. And it takes into account ecological processes, vegetative composition, structure, and anthropogenic disturbance. And so on the graph, you can see that as disturbance by stressors increases, the black line, that is ecological integrity, goes down. And the principle is that as these stressors increase, stressors like fire suppression, invasive species, nitrogen deposition, physical disturbance to a site, those all impact the integrity of the site. So this is something we understand conceptually. This graph is just a nice way of graphically illustrating that. But moreover, ecological integrity can be used to break those up into broad categories in language that we understand, like A, B, C, and D. So sometimes you'll hear people say, related to a particular site, this is an A rank site, or this site's pretty good. And ecological integrity grounded in metrics is a way of saying my A is the same as your A. And then we have objective criteria that underpin that are built on a wealth of background and of scientific sites. And the restoration goal is usually to either maintain or to improve the ecological integrity, right? By helping to alleviate or deal with those stressors, by counteracting fire suppression or brush invasion or controlling invasive species. And so in doing so, we were trying to move the needle on ecological integrity. And that map that I showed before, that's exactly what they were trying to do. That's what they were showing and demonstrating, that they had in fact moved the needle on ecological integrity and on a particular metric. So before we dive into the actual Barrens monitoring protocol, I want to ground ourselves in some basic principles of oak barrens ecology. I'm going to show what may appear to be a rather complicated figure. The goal is not to read everything in the figure, but it's just to illustrate kind of where we started from as ecologists trying to understand oak barrens, and that's just with what ecologists call a conceptual ecological model, where we are thinking about what landscapes do oak barrens occur on. What ecological processes? What are the system drivers? Those are the boxes in red and green. Those drivers, those ecological processes are important things to consider. And we also consider broad stressors, right? Those are the orange bubbles, things like fire suppression, invasive species, other things like climate change, development, nitrogen deposition. And finally, we think about how do those stressors and the drivers and processes kind of interact to influence composition, especially composition and structure. So I don't want you to get hung up, on all of the details in this slide, but know that we started with this broad understanding of oak barrens, and this is one way of just graphically illustrating these complex relationships. And in actuality, it's much more complex than even this graph can illustrate. So course level metrics or course level monitoring focuses on what we call key ecological attributes that are grounded in ecological integrity, and that is again the processes, the structural and compositional characteristics of a site. And we take those ecological attributes and then we boil them down into what we call course level metrics, and they are designed to be easily estimated in the field without a lot of again, but botanical expertise, without plots, transects, time-consuming efforts. The precision might be lower compared to those other highly quantitative methods, but it's easier to implement by non-experts, and we find, and others have found before us, that this type of monitoring is usually sufficient to guide management. If you have, there may be cases where you have specific monitoring questions or issues related to a highly sensitive rare species like the Cardinal blue butterfly, and you may need to do more intensive monitoring around a particular focal species or indicator plant, and that's totally appropriate. We needed something that was broadly applicable for all sites, all barren sites across the state. And the great thing is that it's complementary to other methods that you might do. So you've probably been dying to know, like, what are the course level metrics? And so here they are. Again, they're founded on those key ecological attributes and informed by Barrens ecology, and underpinned by ecological integrity. And they include native species, invasive species, native disturbance indicators, and we're going to go through all of these in more detail. But I want to give you the big picture view first. They also include conservative indicator species, native grasses and sedges, tree composition, so what are your tree species kind of at that level on the site. And then, so all those kind of fall under the umbrella of composition, and there's another suite of parallel metrics that fall under the umbrella of structure, and that includes shrub cover of saplings and tall shrubs, tree cover, and then finally spatial heterogeneity. That is, what's the spatial arrangement of the canopied areas and the open patches, and is that pretty heterogeneous across the site, or is that relatively homogeneous and uniform? And so again, these were inspired by standard ecological integrity measures promoted by NatureServe, as well as materials previously produced by the Nature Conservancy and U.S. Forest Service. But the idea is that each of these things are askable not only to ecological integrity, but they're biologically meaningful, and they can be applied to specific habitat management objectives. So we started with this list, or maybe a modified list of this, and then we did some pilot sampling across the state. And we drafted initial criteria, initial metrics from the literature. And then we went out and we tested them ourselves on a number of sites across the state. we looked at a total of 10 assessment areas, so not a huge sample size, but enough to get a representative sample across the site. And those sites ranged in quality along that ecological integrity gradient from really high quality sites that we would call an A to low quality sites or a D. We then summarized the data by quality, and we did some significant adjusting of the criteria. I will say for those who are interested, what we're presenting today are the course level metrics that can be easily estimated. You don't have to have a lot of botanical expertise, but when we did this pilot sampling, we did a more detailed protocol using time meander surveys and a detailed plant list that we tried to identify every single species that we could within a standard protocol across a given site, and then we tried to distill that through the metrics, and then think about how could we distill that further into metrics that you could easily estimate without having without needing to identify all the species at a given site. But those two methods are really complementary, and so if you really want detailed information, you can have a botanist go out and do the more detailed protocol, and then you'll get a little more fine-grained detail, but the two methods rely on the same, in theory should give you the exact same metric score. So without further ado, let's dive into the metrics themselves. So the first metric is the relative percent cover of all native plants, and you can see for each metric I'm going to have a small table with the metric on the left side and then the thresholds for A, B, C, and D along that graph of ecological integrity across the top. And occasionally we do break the ABC down into like A or A minus, C or C minus for a handful of metrics, and those will be obvious. So the relative percent cover of all native plants. I will try to explain the rationale between each metric real briefly too. This one should be fairly straightforward. Sites with a higher proportion of native species have higher ecological integrity. To estimate this metric, it might be easiest to estimate cover of all native species and compare it with the cover of all invasive species. So the total cover will likely be over 100% for native species, especially because you have multiple structural layers. And so in the first example here, we have native trees at 40%, shrubs at 10%, all the herbaceous species combined at a hypothetical 100% cover, and invasive species maybe 1% cover. So you add up all of those covers of the native species for 150%. You then add in the invasive at 1%, and you come up with a relative native cover of less than it's over 99% native. Another way to think about this is what's the ratio of native plants to invasive plants in terms of percent cover, and is it better than 99 to 1? Now this may seem, depending on what sites you're familiar with, this may seem like an impossible threshold to meet, and we started thinking that way too until we went to one site, and it indeed not only had greater than 99% native, there were 0 invasive species in the entire assessment area. And the point of some of these breakdowns is to pull apart the really best sites into their own category so they really stand apart. But again, we recognize that that's a hard threshold to meet for some of these, and hence we break them up into like A and an A minus. A minus is also very good, just not quite perfect. And then you can see the other breakdowns there. In example 2, relatively similar, except that we've reduced native herbaceous species to 90% cover. Invasive species are now at 10% cover, and then that ratio is about 93% native cover, which puts it into the B category, which again is still considered like good ecological integrity. Moving on to the next metric is the total cover of invasive species. And if you are thinking, hey, didn't we just talk about natives and invasives in the last one? We did, but we believe, and other very good scientists at NatureServe believe it's important to track invasive species separately than just the relative cover of natives to non-natives, as invasives measures slightly different aspects of overall composition, with this in particular being a more direct measure of degradation. And so invasive species really refers to species that have a high capacity to really degrade the site quickly, crowd out native species, interfere with habitat for wildlife, limit management options at time. And so examples of common invasive species might include spotted knapweed, orange hawkweed, Kentucky bluegrass, sweet clover, things of that nature. And again, believe it or not, there are some sites that have less than 1% invasives. Yeah, but it's common to find them in the 3% range. The 4 to 10 range is really common. But once you get over a threshold of 30% cover, that's pretty degraded. The next metric is the total cover of native disturbance indicators. Some people refer to these as the native species that can be invasive on a site. We prefer the term native disturbance indicators because they indicate some sort of a stressor or ecological disruption in the process. So largely this is referring to Pennsylvania sedge, but it can also include bracken fern in certain places, rubus species, those blackberries, raspberries, bristleberries, especially Rubus flagellaris can be really problematic in some areas. And so again, these are native species though, and so there's different thresholds for these. It's not that we never expect to see pen sedge or bracken fern or rubus at a site. Of course we expect to see those. But when they get really dominant, when you have 50% cover, 60% cover, that's indicating a degraded site. We really wrestled over these thresholds, but again, we refined them based on the field data that we collected across a gradient of sites. The next metric is the number of native indicator species, in particular species that are relatively conservative. If you're familiar with the C-value concept, plants are assigned to, have been evaluated as to the degree to which they indicate relatively undisturbed habitats, that is sites that don't receive a lot of anthropogenic disturbance versus species that thrive in anthropogenic disturbances. That's a number that ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being conservative. These species are for the most part on the higher end of that. I want to say a C-value of 6 or higher, with many of them being 7 or 8, or even higher than that. So you may be wondering, what are these? How do I know whether it's a native indicator species or not? Well, we have created an indicator species checklist, again, kind of based on some literature and field surveys of our own, with the idea being that as you walk through a site, you check these species off as you see them. This is the part that does require a little bit of plant knowledge, but we tried to pick species that were relatively easy to identify and that were relatively widespread in the state. We tried to avoid species that only occurred in the northeast, northwest, or only occurred along the lower Wisconsin Riverway. And the idea is that they hopefully are easy to identify at the time of year when you would do this monitoring, and which we recommend being like July to August for a number of reasons. One of the other metrics, kind of also related back to the pen sedge example, is a total cover of native grasses and sedges, not including pen sedge. So where you see pen sedge, visually take it out in your mind and ask yourself, of the remaining, native grasses and sedges, what's left. And the higher percentage you have there, the better a site is. We tried a couple of different variations of this in pilot testing, and we really came down to just this percent cover estimate as being the most useful and hopefully the easiest to estimate without needing a lot of plant knowledge. So happy to explain how we arrived at that one in more detail, but for the sake of time, I'll continue. I'll briefly talk about the rationale here. A healthy Barrens is going to have fire-dependent fuels, but also like included in that is only like a certain number of species, ideally, but also like a greater cover of native graminoid species. But pen sedge can be one that can really take over a site and form a thick, dense mat. Our fellow ecologist who works with the State Natural Areas Program, Nate Farum, sometimes refers to pen sedge where it gets really dense as like pillow sedge because it's so thick you could like lay down on it and rest your head on it. The final metric related to composition relates to the tree composition. So, and just ask whether or not it's appropriate for the region. So, what's the relative percentage of that tree layer? What's the relative percent cover of oaks? Sometimes regionally pine species, especially jack pine or red pine, in that tree layer. And hopefully you should be on the upper end of that. Obviously, if you start to get species like black locust, red maple, a lot of black cherry coming in, that's an indicator that your site is becoming degraded over time. To switch to the structural metrics, and I have them all on this slide. We break it up into 3 categories. Again, the percent cover of shrubs, of the medium statured shrubs, percent cover of saplings, tree saplings, and tall shrubs, that is roughly 6 to 20 feet tall, and then the percent cover of trees that are over 20% tall. And so the rationale for this should be fairly obvious. When your shrubs get really dense and your trees get really dense, it's often due to fire suppression. When they're too dense, it creates a lack of light for oak barrens plants and animals to thrive, and the same is true for the trees. But also note, especially for the saplings and trees, that the A metric actually doesn't start at 0, it starts at 5%. And that's really to get at this idea that a really high quality site should have some trees and saplings if you're going to call it an oak barrens. If you were to cut out all of the oaks to a site, we might start to question, like, why not just call it like a prairie, or a sand barrens. A good quality site should have some minimal threshold of trees, and or saplings. Obviously, there are some sites on the landscape where brush barrens were really common, but that's sort of a special exception. And this should refer, I should have referred to this, is referring to native trees and shrubs. So you would not include invasive shrubs if you have that. And that's going to get taken care of in the other metrics. You might be asking, wow, that's a lot of percent covers. How in the world am I supposed to estimate all those on a site? Well, we have included for you a handy dandy visual guide to percent cover things like this are widely available in the published literature. We took one that broke it out along in these 10 different categories, and that is included right on the bottom of every field form as a reference point. And we find this really useful and helps users stay relatively consistent among their estimates. I want to go back and say between these 2 pictures on the bottom, It is a good example of a site where you might have good structure of a site with this picture on the left. The ecologist in the blue shirt standing in this area where there's scattered oaks, and if you were to go further into the site, you would see that there's a good mix of saplings and small shrubs, medium statured shrubs. And so it actually scores fairly well on structural metrics, but really poorly on composition. Versus the site on the right, which again, if you looked at the data, you would see that the composition is fairly decent, but the structure is starting to become degraded by all this kind of brushy, tall saplings and tall shrubs that are taking over the site. And so one of the points of the metrics is be able to like tease apart why a site might not be reaching its maximum ecological integrity, and to try to develop management prescriptions around those particular aspects. The final metric relates to spatial heterogeneity, and the rationale here is that the spatial arrangement of trees, tree canopies, and the open areas is important for both plants and animals, and a heterogeneous spatial arrangement is much preferred to a site that has areas that are nearly totally open or totally closed and or with a hard edge. So we recognize that this is a more subjective measure, and the graphics provided here are only to provide a visual guide to text that kind of describes this arrangement on the form. And I will avoid reading kind of the whole text that's on the form, but it basically spans the gamut from a complex natural mosaic to B being somewhat heterogeneous, C being somewhat homogeneous, where you have that open canopied area in the upper right and a more closed canopy area on the lower left. But there's some intergrading there. It's not a super hard edge versus D, which is pretty homogeneous, just a couple canopy gaps and or one really large opening with a hard edge. So we put all of these metrics together onto a single page field form. And again, it looks just like it did in the presentation, where the metrics are in a column on the left, and then the ranking guidelines, those criteria, the A, B, C, D aspects of integrity, are included for each there also. And what you would do is go out, ideally with two people, and you would note your observation in the your obs column. You would write down the letter rank that corresponds to. So in the top instance, there's 94% relative cover of native plants, and that falls in the B column, and so your letter rank would be B. And then you would translate that B into a numerical score following a traditional grade point average style scoring, where A is 4, B is 3, C is 2, and D is 1. And then you can roll all of those up by summing all of the numerical scores, dividing by 10. In this case, that sum is 27. Divide by 10, you get 2.7. And then your composite ecological integrity score for the entire site is 2.7, which translates to a B minus. Again, which is like it's not bad. It falls into the good, maybe good sliding into fair category. The other advantage of this monitoring approach, and this is really emphasized by people we talked to at the Nature Conservancy and staff at the Forest Service, really felt strongly about this too, is that by ranking each criteria separately, you can also pull out which criteria are dragging your score down. Where is ecological integrity being compromised? And in this example, it's that there's some of these native disturbance indicators that are starting to dominate the site. Maybe that's pen sedge. That gives you a C rank in that category. Maybe your shrubs and your trees are getting a little overly dense, kind of dragging you down in that category. And maybe the spatial heterogeneity is really poor. And so you need to take some steps to address those particular metrics. But it tells you that this could be a really high priority site to work in because your number of indicator species is really high. That's in the A category. Your percentage of native to invasive plants is really high. You have relatively low cover of invasive species. And so this site has a lot of potential. It's being dragged down by things that can be addressed via specific management prescriptions. And so that's the real advantage of it. And not only that, but then you could use this as the 2019 example. You could design your treatment, and then in the following years, following the treatment, you could go back and do the same protocol and see how the site is changing over time, both the overall score and on particular metrics. And so I'll go into the more detailed protocol now. I'll just give it a real quick overview. You would divide your site into management areas. In this simple example, there might be just one main management unit or assessment area. You would have ideally at least 2 people meander together through the assessment area and estimate each metric kind of together. And the idea of 2 people doing it together is that they can talk about it, and they can say, like, I think in the invasives were maybe 1 to 2% cover, and somebody else might say, like, well, I think they're maybe like 2 to 3% cover, but let's meet in the middle, let's call it 2. Either way, we're solidly in the B range. And so it becomes less important whether you're 1 or 2 or 3, but that you agree that we are somewhere within the threshold of an A, B, C, or D. You would then calculate the numerical scores and the overall score for the site. And with experience, this would take certainly less than a day for a relatively small area like this. That's maybe 20 acres or so, maybe 30 acres. You could probably do it in a few hours, again, with experience. A more complicated example, you might design a site up into multiple management units. In this case, the large black outline of the site is a site that might be an open oak barrens management unit. You might have an area in blue that's more, maybe you're managing more for a closed canopy barrens, or maybe you'd like to make it more open, but currently its current state is that's a little more closed canopy, and so you might be thinking about your management prescriptions a little differently there. And then finally, in red, you have some sand barrens, which might have their own criteria that you use to address. But the idea here is that you try to avoid doing one assessment area that spans a huge range of conditions, because then it becomes hard to track and hard to average. How would you average canopy cover and heterogeneity over the whole unit? Sometimes it's easier to let's divide up into this unit A and unit B, and proceed from there. Some people take this really seriously and might divide their site up into like 30 management units, and that's a little more complicated. Really depends on what your goals for the site are. As an optional thing, you can establish a survey route a priori, and that indicates the route that you're going to walk each time, roughly, kind of through the site. And this is to ensure that you hit all the major habitat patches. It's particularly important for sites that can be a little brushy in places, because it's really tempting when you're walking around to take the path of least resistance, stay in the open areas, and think to yourself, like, gosh, like my shrub cover is really low. When in reality, you want to make sure that you spend equal time in those more dense areas to open areas so that you get an accurate metric. So to kind of wrap up a little bit and to kind of come back to some of the big picture things, there's a lot of potential uses, for this. We think it would be, you could use it to objectively evaluate initial baseline quality, composition, and structure of barrens. It can help get different types of managers on the same page, whether you're a forester, a wildlife biologist, a conservation biologist, and using the same metrics and sort of see, I'm on the standard quantitative thresholds, like what we're in the higher quality area, or we need to address this area here because it's dragging our score down. It can be used to link management to function and quality and integrity, and obviously it can assess restoration progress over time without needing a lot of plots or time or expert plant knowledge. And then to close the next steps, we have a field day scheduled at Lawrence Creek State Natural Area on August 7th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we really hope a lot of people come out to that. And again, I want to go back to one of my starting points and emphasize that we really view these as a draft right now. This is the best that we've been able to come up with, but we really want your feedback as managers, as land stewards, as people who work on the ground every day, who already have a really full plate, to really try to refine them into things that are easy to estimate, but also really useful from assessing baseline conditions, tracking progress over time, and all of that good stuff. So with that, we'll take any questions.